Black Hills, Dakota Territory, August 1883. The air was a liar. It spoke of endless summer, of warm pine and sun-baked granite, but Alara Reese knew its promises were hollow. She had seen only one winter in this raw, unforgiving land, and it had been enough. It had taken her husband, Hütte, not with the sudden violence of the mine collapse that had scarred their life in Wales, but with the slow, insidious grind of a cough that turned to blood in the relentless, cabin-bound cold. Now, she and her 7-year-old son, also named Reese, were alone with nothing but a poorly built cabin and a deed to a patch of land that was mostly rock. The cabin was the heart of her fear. It had been built in a hurry by men who thought strength was a matter of size, not sense. The logs were massive, but the chinking was a crumbling mix of mud and grass, a lattice work of invitations for the winter wind. The great stone fireplace, which the cellar had boasted of, was a monster of inefficiency. Alara knew it would consume a forest's worth of wood only to send 90% of the heat straight up into the uncaring sky, while its powerful draw would actively suck the very warmth from their bones and pull the cold in through every crack. It was not a source of heat. It was a machine for making a room colder. She had watched the other settlers that summer. They stockpiled wood with a kind of frantic energy, their days measured in the ringing of axes and the crashing of felled trees. Great stacks of cordwood rose beside their homes, monuments to their faith in brute force. They looked at Alara's small, slowly growing pile with a mixture of pity and contempt. A widow, alone with a boy, a liability. They assumed she was either lazy or ignorant of the coming trial. She was neither. She was terrified, and terror was a great clarifier of thought. Alara knew she could not win their game. She could not cut enough wood. She could not rebuild the cabin. She had to change the rules. Her mind, honed by a life spent with a man who understood the earth's deep secrets, turned not to the forest, but to the ground beneath her feet. Daffod had been a collier, a man who lived more of his waking life in the dark than in the sun. He spoke of the tunnels not as places of dread, but of deep constancy. Down below, Alara, he would say, his voice still thick with the Welsh valleys, the seasons forget themselves. The rock holds a memory of warmth. It doesn't give it up easy, but it doesn't forget it, either. Her cabin was backed against the gradual slope of a granite hill, a solid, unmoving mass of ancient stone. To the others, it was an obstacle, a worthless piece of the plot that couldn't be farmed or grazed. To Alara, it was an anchor. It was a battery. It was the only resource she possessed in abundance. An idea, born of desperation and whispered memories, began to take shape. It was a wild, almost blasphemous thought in a land where men built upwards, always upwards, reaching for the sky. She would dig. She would not try to heat the cabin's air, a fleeting, transient thing that betrayed you in an instant. She would heat the mass that held the cabin. She would store the summer's warmth and the fire's fury in the stone itself. Her plan was simple in concept, monumental in execution. She would dismantle the back of the great, wasteful fireplace. From its smoldering heart, she would dig a tunnel, a long, horizontal flue running 40 Fuß into the belly of the hill behind her home. At its end, a vertical chimney would rise, emerging from the earth far up the slope. She began in late August, when the ground was still forgiving. The first few days were spent dismantling the crude stonework of the fireplace, a task that left her hands raw and her body aching. Little Reese watched her, his face a mask of childish gravity. He helped where he could, hauling smaller stones in his arms, his small grunts of effort a constant, motivating rhythm. He did not ask what she was doing. He simply trusted her. It was a trust so absolute, it felt like a physical weight, a burden she could not afford to drop. When the opening was clear, a dark maw in the back of their hearth, she took Daffod's pickaxe and struck the first blow against the hillside. The earth was a mix of dense clay and decomposed granite, studded with rocks that jarred her arms with every impact. It was slow, brutal work. Each foot of progress was a victory measured in sweat and blisters. She was not just digging a tunnel, she was excavating a memory, channeling the ghost of her husband, his knowledge of shoring, of airflow, of the patient, relentless dialogue between man and rock. It did not take long for the town to notice. First came the whispers, then the open stares. Then came Silas Thorne. Thorne was the town's master builder, a man whose certainty was as solid and square as the houses he constructed. He arrived one afternoon, his shadow falling long and broad over her work. He was not a cruel man, but his confidence left no room for ideas other than his own. He watched for a long moment as Alara, covered in dirt, emerged from the shallow beginnings of her tunnel, dragging a bucket of soil. "Mistress Reese," he began, his voice accustomed to being a bait, "what is the meaning of this foolishness?" Alara straightened her back, wiping a smear of mud from her cheek with the back of her hand. "I am improving my hearth, Mr. Ton." He gestured dismissively at the hole. "Improving it? You're destroying it, and for what? A root cellar in the wrong place." He saw the pickaxe, the growing pile of earth. "You mean to tunnel into that hill? From your fireplace?" The idea was so absurd to him that he almost laughed. "I do," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Thorne's face hardened, his professional pride offended. "Woman, have you lost your senses? You'll kill yourself and the boy. The smoke, it will have nowhere to go. It will pour back into your home and suffocate you in your sleep. You are digging a grave, not a flue. This is madness." The word hung in the air. Madness. She had heard it before, whispered by the other women at the general store. The widow's grief has turned her mindestens that Welsh woman is digging her own coffin. They saw a fragile woman succumbing to a strange, foreign delusion. They did not see the cold, hard engineering taking shape in her mindestens. "Smoke has weight, Mr. Ton," Alara said, her gaze steady, "but it is lighter than cold air, and it is lazy. It prefers to climb." "Climb? You are asking it to run a 40-foot race on its belly before it can stand up. It won't do it, it will turn back. It will choose the path of least resistance, right back into this room." He shook his head, a final, damning verdict. "Seal this hole. I will have some of the men help you rebuild the chimney properly. We cannot have a liability in this community. We all depend on each other come winter." His offer, meant as kindness, was the deepest insult. He saw her as a problem to be managed, a weak link. He did not see a solution. "The smoke will make the journey," she said, her voice dropping, carrying a conviction that unsettled him. "And I will make it pay for its passage." He stared at her, utterly baffled. "Pay? What nonsense is this?" "It will pay with its heat," she said, turning back to her work, every inch of the way. Silas Thorne left that day convinced the woman was a lost cause. His report to the others in the town solidified their judgment. Alara Reese was a fool, and her folly would be a tragedy come the first freeze. The community collectively washed its hands of her. Pity curdled into a heart, self-righteous certainty. They would not help a woman who refused to be helped. Her isolation was now complete. She had only the boy, the memory of her husband, and the growing darkness of the tunnel. The work became her entire world. The sun would rise, and she would descend into the earth. She lined the tunnel with flat stone she and Reese gathered from a nearby creek. Bed, creating a smooth, solid channel about 2 Fuß wide and 3 Fuß high. It was a cramped, suffocating space. Her only light was a single lantern that cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. She learnt the language of the rock, the subtle shifts in texture that warned of a large, unmovable boulder, or a pocket of softer soil. She shored up the roof with thick timbers, just as Daffod had taught her, creating a structure that was immensely strong, braced by the very earth it pierced. Reese was her lifeline. He would sit at the tunnel's entrance, a small sentinel, talking to her. His high, clear voice, a thread of sound connecting her to the living world. He brought her water. He warned her when the sun was setting. He never complained. He was a collier's son, and this strange, dark work seemed to make a kind of ancestral sense to him. By mid-October, as the aspens turned a brilliant, heartbreaking yellow, and the nights grew teeth, the tunnel was complete. 40 Fuß it ran, straight and true into the hillside. At the far end, she had painstakingly built a vertical shaft that rose another 20 Fuß, emerging from a carefully constructed stone chimney on the slope, barely visible from the cabin below. The final piece was the firebox itself. She rebuilt it inside the cabin, at the mouth of the tunnel, but it was nothing like the gaping maw of a traditional hearth. It was small, tight, and tall. A design meant for a fast, ferociously hot burn. An insulated, vertical chamber where the fire could roar with maximum efficiency. Her last task was to seal the old, massive chimney flue above the new firebox. She packed it with rock and sealed it with a clay mixture of her own devising. That act, more than any other, was a declaration of war against convention. She had severed her ties to the sky. She was placing her faith entirely in the earth. The narrative of her folly was now complete in the eyes of the town. She had sealed her own tomb. They waited for the first deep cold, for the inevitable news that the widow and her son had been found, still and silent in a cabin full of smoke. What they did not understand, what Silas Thorne, in his rigid certainty, could not comprehend, was the profound and elegant physics of her creation. He, and everyone else, was locked in a battle of attrition with winter. A battle they were destined to lose. A conventional fireplace is an act of spectacular wastefulness. The combustion is inefficient, creating vast amounts of smoke and creosote. The heat generated in a massive, uncontrolled burst, radiates into the room, yes, but its most powerful effect is the creation of a massive draft. It is a pump. For every cubic foot of hot air and smoke that escapes up the chimney, a cubic foot of cold, dense, outside air is pulled in through every crack and gap in the cabin walls. You feed the fire, and the fire, in turn, feeds the cold. You burn a mountain of wood just to feel a fleeting warmth on your face while your back freezes. Alara's system was different. It was a closed loop of logic. It was not about generating a massive, roaring fire. It was about wringing every last calorie of heat from a small, efficient one. Her firebox, tall and insulated, created a blaze so hot it burnt the wood more completely, consuming the smoke itself. This produced a stream of extremely hot, fast-moving gas. This gas, having nowhere else to go, was forced into the horizontal stone tunnel. Here, the second principle came into play. Heat exchange. As the superheated exhaust traveled along the 40-foot stone path, it was forced into intimate contact with the cool, dense materials of the tunnel lining and the surrounding earth. The laws of thermodynamics are relentless. Heat moves from hot to cold. The hot gas had no choice but to surrender its energy, to pay its rent, as Alara had set. The stones of the tunnel absorbed the heat. The clay absorbed the heat. The deep, ancient granite of the hill itself began to soak it up. By the time the exhaust gases reached the base of the vertical chimney, 40 Fuß away, they were no longer a raging torrent of heat. They were cooled, Talmud, having given up the vast majority of their thermal energy to the earth. They were still warmer than the outside air, however, and this temperature differential was all that was needed for the final, crucial principle. The draw. The cooler, but still buoyant gases rose up the 20-foot vertical chimney, and as they did, they created a powerful, steady suction that pulled the next rush of hot gas from the firebox behind it, keeping the entire system flowing in a smooth, continuous loop. There was no backpuffing, no smoke filling the cabin, because the long, tall chimney at the end of the line was a more powerful and attractive escape route than the short path back into the room. The final, most beautiful part of the system was the concept of thermal mass. The tons and tons of earth and rock that now held the fire's warmth did not release it quickly. They became a thermal battery, a massive, slow-release heat source. The granite of the hill, the clay under her floorboards, the very stone wall at the back of her cabin, they were now part of her heating system. They radiated a gentle, pervasive warmth back into the living space long after the fire itself had died down. She wasn't heating the air. She was heating the house itself. She had turned her greatest liability, the cold, unyielding earth, into her most powerful ally. The first test came in early November. A cold snap descended, and the ground froze solid. In the town, the great fireplaces were lit, their chimneys pluming smoke into the gray sky. Alara lit a small, brisk fire in her new firebox. For 2 hours it roared, consuming a surprisingly small amount of wood. Then she let it die out. There was no immediate, dramatic wave of heat, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, a deep, foundational warmth began to seep into the cabin. The floor, once a source of chilling drafts, became neutral, then faintly warm to the touch. The back wall, the one connected to the hill, began to radiate a gentle heat, like a sun-warmed stone on a summer afternoon. The cabin was not hot. It was simply not cold. The chill had been banished. Ries, who had always worn shoes and 2 layers of shirts inside, took his shoes off. He sat on the floor and played with his carved wooden soldiers without a shiver. Alara put her hand on the stone wall behind their cots and felt the steady, reliable warmth. It was the warmth of the deep earth. It was David's memory made real, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that they would survive. Winter arrived in the second week of January. It did not come gradually. It fell from the sky like a wall. Old-timers would later call it the winter of the blue stillness, a name born of the strange, azure tint the world took on under a sky scoured clean by a relentless Arctic wind. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero, then 30, then 40. It stayed there for 3 weeks. Nothing moved. The air was so cold, it was like breathing powdered glass. Trees exploded in the forest, their sap freezing and expanding with a sound like a rifle shot. It was a cold that killed, a cold that was a predator. For Silas Thorne, the world had shrunk to the space between his woodpile and his hearth. His house, the finest in the settlement, a testament to his craft with its perfectly dovetailed corners and massive stone chimney, had become a fortress under siege. And it was losing. He burned wood with a frantic, desperate hunger. A huge, roaring fire was the only thing that kept the room from freezing solid. But it was a losing battle. The heat barely reached the far corners of the main room, where frost coated the inside of the walls in delicate, deadly ferns. His wife and 3 children lived in a small circle of blankets around the hearth, their faces flushed from the direct heat, their backs freezing. The wood pile, which had seemed a mountain in autumn, was melting away like snow. Every trip outside was a life-threatening ordeal, a plunge into a hostile element that stole the breath and burnt the skin. He felt his mastery, his entire identity as a builder and a provider, cracking and splintering like the frozen logs he fed to the fire. His knowledge was failing him. His strength was not enough. He thought of the Welsh widow, Ihrer. He thought of her with a grim, sorrowful anger. He imagined her and the boy frozen in their beds, victims of her stubborn foolishness. It was a tragedy, but one she had brought upon herself. The thought gave him no comfort. It was just one more failure in a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible. In Ilara's cabin, life continued with a quiet, miraculous normalcy. In the morning, she would light a fire. It burned for an hour, consuming a few small logs with a clean, intense roar. In the evening, she would do the same. For the rest of the day and through the long, brutal night, the cabin remained a sanctuary of stable, gentle warmth. The floor was warm. The back wall was a constant radiator of mild heat. The air was fresh and still. There were no drafts because her sealed, efficient system did not need to suck the life out of the room to feed itself. Ries played on the floor. Ihrer mended their clothes, cooked their simple meals, and read to him from the one book they owned, its pages soft with use. The frost that coated the outside of their small windowpane was thick and opaque, sealing them off from the lethal world outside. But inside, they were not merely surviving. They were living. The cold was not a predator clawing at the walls. It was a distant, irrelevant fast. She had built more than a clever hearth. She had built an island of temperate climate in the middle of an Arctic sea. She had made a covenant with the earth, and the earth was keeping its promise. The crisis in town came on the 19th day of the freeze. Thorne's woodpile was gone. He was now burning furniture, a chair, a small table, the boards from a spare bed frame. The end was no longer a vague threat. It was a matter of hours. His youngest daughter, Zara, was sick. Her breathing shallow, her body shivering uncontrollably, even under a pile of every blanket they owned. He looked at her, and the last of his pride shattered. It was not enough to be right. It was not enough to be strong. You had to be warm. He made a decision born of absolute desperation. He would go to the widow's cabin, not to save her, but to scavenge. He reasoned that she and the boy must have succumbed days ago. Her small woodpile would still be there. It was a ghastly thought, to steal from the dead, but the image of his own daughter's face eclipsed all other moral considerations. He wrapped himself in every layer he owned and plunged into the blue stillness. The 40 below air was a physical blow. The 100 yards to her cabin felt like a mile. The snow was squeaking under his boots, a dry, alien sound. He approached the cabin, his heart a cold knot of dread and grim purpose. He expected silence. He expected a chimney free of smoke, a tomb of ice. But there was a light in the window, a warm, yellow light. He stopped, confused. It made no sense. Had someone else found her? Was the sheriff there? He moved closer, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. He reached the door and hesitated. Then, driven by the wind and the image of his sick child, he pounded on it with his gloved fist. The sound was loud in the frozen silence. After a moment, the bar on the inside scraped back and the door opened. Ihrer stood there. She was not wrapped in furs. She wore a simple wool dress. Behind her, the boy, Reese, looked up from the floor where he was playing with his soldiers. He was in his shirt sleeves. And then, the heat hit him. It was not the scorching, aggressive heat of his own fireplace. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth, an impossible warmth. It flowed out of the cabin and enveloped him. And in that moment, Silas Thorne's world and everything he thought he knew was turned upside down. He stumbled inside, past the woman, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked for the fire. He saw the small, tidy hearth, but there was no raging inferno within it, only a bed of glowing coals. It was not possible. A fire that small could not heat a space this well, not in this cold. It defied the laws of nature as he understood them. He looked around the room. There was no smoke. The air was clear. He saw the boy comfortable and healthy on the floor. He saw the woman, her expression calm, her eyes holding no triumph, only a deep, weary understanding. Instinctively, he reached out and placed his bare hand on the stone wall at the back of the cabin. It was warm, not hot, but distinctly, undeniably warm, a deep, radiant heat that seemed to come from the very heart of the stone. He pressed his palm flat against it, feeling the impossible, life-giving energy. He dropped to one knee and placed his hand on the wooden floorboards. They, too, were warm. He was in a room being heated from below and behind, heated by the very structure of the house itself. The truth crashed down on him, a physical blow. Madness was not madness. It was a genius so profound, he had been utterly blind to it. She wasn't fighting the cold. She had harnessed it, she had made the earth her furnace. He looked up at her, his face weathered by years of pride and certainty crumbling into something new, into humility, into awe. All his strength, all his knowledge, all his monuments of wood and stone were monuments to a flawed idea. He had been building shields. She had built a source. One word escaped his lips, a ragged whisper that held the weight of his entire, shattered worldview. How? Ihrer did not